For more on the committee's hearing and the rest of today's political news, let's bring in Ed O'Keefe and Nicholas Wu. Ed is, of course, CBS News senior White House and political correspondent, and Nicholas is congressional reporter for Politico. Thank you both so much for being here on this busy day. I want to start with former Attorney General Barr, because he was featured very prominently in today's testimony. Let's take a listen to him today, talking about what he did between the election and his resignation.
I was in the posture of trying to figure out, there was an avalanche of all these allegations of fraud that built up over a number of days, and it was like playing whack-a-mole because something would come out one day and then the next day it would be another issue. Also, I was influenced by the fact that all the early claims that I understood were completely bogus and silly and usually based on complete misinformation. And so I didn't consider the quality of claims right out of the box to give me any, feeling that there was really substance here.
So, Ed, it's notable that this isn't, of course, what Barr was saying publicly at the time, but he's been such a prominent fixture of these hearings. I'm kind of curious on your take on that, but also curious how President Biden might be reacting. What do we know about how closely, if at all, he's following these hearings?
Well, let's start with the current president. He was flying back from Delaware this morning as the hearings were underway, walked into the Oval Office for his daily security briefing as it was wrapping up. So he was not actively watching it today, nor was he last week when he was hosting a dinner for leaders attending the Summit of the Americas. We asked today to get some sense of how he's being briefed on it or if he goes back and watches it later. And the White House kind of dismissed it and said, no, not necessarily, but he is being made abreast of the developments. And he did say last week when he was in Los Angeles that he's aware of the importance and the severity of what's being discussed and is glad to see that it is being reviewed. As for Attorney General Barr, you're right. We've pointed this out in our coverage throughout the day today. What the former Attorney General now says does not compute with what he was saying publicly, even as he was apparently so vociferously disagreeing with the former president. So, whether or not the committee is going to point that out at all over the course of this remains to be seen, because if you really do want to hold these people accountable, you might ask them, well, why were you saying one thing publicly and then believing this, at least now after the fact, more than a year later? That hasn't necessarily been asked of him or any of the others that have testified so far, other than perhaps maybe they came to their senses and embraced reality and wanted to maintain a relationship with the president out of concern about how he'd react. We don't know.
And Nicholas, you were in the room for today's hearings. From your sense, from what you've seen and what's happened so far, does it seem like these hearings are having any sort of impact around Capitol Hill?
It's important to remember that we're still early on in the hearing process, but these are no normal Capitol Hill hearings. Under somewhat normal circumstances with a congressional hearing, you would have more witness testimony. You'd hear extensive questioning from lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. But with these, there's not actually that much questioning of the witnesses going on in the room. As we saw in the clip that was played earlier, this is all questioning that happened within the last weeks or months leading up to these. This is all pre-recorded and then compiled by the committee. And so whether or not this ends up breaking through depends on who's watching mostly. So far, it looks like many folks on Capitol Hill are keeping an eye on the hearings, but are so far declining to comment on a lot of the substance of this until more of this comes out.
Right, and we have more hearings this week as well. Another big thing happening on Capitol Hill this week is that a bipartisan group of 20 senators, including 10 Republicans that are just critical, of course, to passing any sort of legislation, have reached an early agreement, emphasizing agreement, not yet legislation, on gun control. Nick, from your take, I mean, this framework, it notably includes incentives to pass for states to pass red flag laws, boost mental health resources, provide funding for school safety and resources. Can you kind of take us behind the scenes a little bit? What went into all of these negotiations? And do you think that this can actually pass before Congress heads out of town for July 4th recess?
There's certainly a lot of closed doors haggling that went on into crafting all of this legislation. I mean, you went from what many Democrats would have wanted, which is more expansive curbs on, say, assault weapons or even stricter background checks and the like to this framework for a compromise here. But turning this into something that can become law before Congress skips town, it's something that both sides are certainly optimistic about. The Senate Majority Leader Schumer said today that as soon as there is text, it's something that he would immediately put on the floor. And you've seen so far some progressive Democrats that would have otherwise objected to such a narrow deal, otherwise coming out in support of this. But the devil is really in the details here for what goes from this whole framework into legislative text, if that's even possible. And the question really is something like this going to be able to pass the Senate? Can this very fragile coalition of lawmakers stay together to bring it into law?
Fragile coalition indeed. Ed, I'm curious what the White House is thinking about all of this, because President Biden released a statement on Sunday saying that the agreement is heading in, quote, the right direction. But this is a president who has a long history with gun legislation and was tasked by his boss at the time, Obama, to set up a task force. He's intimately knowledgeable about these issues. They are not addressing a lot of the things on his wish list. Do you have any sense about whether the White House is actually happy with what has come from this framework, and are they going to continue to push for more action beyond this legislation?
Well, remember what the White House has said and what top negotiators have said is that we have to, quote unquote, do something. We don't have to do everything, but we have to do something and demonstrate that Congress and Washington can react to these terrible tragedies and not ignore them or not let them go on for naught. So under the category of succeeding in doing something, by getting a framework agreement, yes. By writing it into legislation this week, sure. And making sure those 20 negotiators are on board, and then the entire Democratic caucus, maybe a handful of the Republicans. If you keep moving in that direction, great. But it does, from a crass political standpoint, allow Democrats to continue campaigning on the idea of, well, we did this, but one day we'd like to do that. And that includes raising the age limit on assault weapons, banning them outright, making other changes. And in order to do that, you got to elect more Democrats to Congress. Just as they'll argue this summer, if you want to restore abortion rights at the federal level, you got to elect enough Democrats in order to do that in the House and the Senate. And that's the other thing we got to watch here. Okay, it passes the Senate, great, but it takes two to tango. What will Democrats in the House think of this? What will perhaps just a handful of moderate swing district Republicans think of this, mostly from the coasts? And can they sign on as well? And is there a general agreement that, okay, we did something, we compromised, we got a few things done here, we're going to hand out a lot more money, but we're going to continue to agree to disagree on these other issues unless or until, God forbid, there's another shooting like it, or unless or until the political equation in Congress changes and one party or the other has enough to do something through the Senate to address this again in the future. So the White House is fine with what's going on so far, wouldn't divulge if the president, for example, has spoken with any of the Republican negotiators like John Cornyn or Rob Portman or Roy Blunt, but definitely has been in touch with the Democratic side. And you notice that both he and Majority Leader Schumer said, great to see things are happening. It's not everything we want, including a ban on assault weapons, but we'll let them keep talking, keep writing, and see if it can get passed.
Long way to go before it gets to the president's desk, a good reminder. Meanwhile, Ed, I wanted to ask you about another political issue that this president and Democrats are facing, the economy, inflation, gas prices, of course. Gas prices are at a record $5 a gallon. That's according to the AAA. And much higher, of course, in places like California. They're up almost 60 cents more than they were a month ago. So after some back and forth, the White House said that the president will visit Saudi Arabia, but he's not sure about meeting with the Crown Prince yet. Do you have any sense of what's happening on that trip and what the goal would be?
They're talking generally about the idea of visiting not only Saudi Arabia, but also Israel. And within Israel, possibly the Palestinian territories, or at least meeting with Palestinian officials. If he goes to Saudi Arabia, if he goes to Israel, it would be as part of broader conversations about regional security issues. And yes, trying to make amends or at least keep things going well with Saudi Arabia. But he explicitly said over the weekend, and the White House again confirmed today, this isn't about going and explicitly saying to them, please pump more gas so that the price comes down. It's about broader security and energy policy conversations overall. Because remember, part of why they want a boosted supply from Middle Eastern suppliers is to make up for the Russian void that's now occurring as Europe cuts off its supply from Russia as well. So, there seems to be some reluctance to confirm this, reluctance of the president to make it happen, because there'll be a question of who exactly he speaks with, whether that includes the Crown Prince, who of course is responsible for the murder of that Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi, and what the president said as a candidate about Saudi Arabia being a pariah and that it should be treated as such. It's going to be a major hypocritical moment for him, potentially, should he go over there and meet with the Crown Prince and have to try to make nice after campaigning on a pledge to play tough with them. But the realities now, of course, are gas is going up, Saudi Arabia is a big provider, and the U.S. has got to figure out a way to work with them and see if supply can be boosted.
Delicate diplomacy. Ed O'Keefe and Nicholas Wu, a lot to cover this week from Capitol Hill to the White House. Appreciate all your time today.
Take care.
Thanks.